Just weeks before his quiet passing at 86, Jack Nicholson, Hollywood's rebel, the man behind The Shining in 1980 and As Good as It Gets in 1997, spoke with rare honesty. He admitted not to scandals, but to something more haunting: 5 deepest regrets that lingered through his life. They weren't about fame, fortune, or Oscars, but about silence, solitude, and the paths left untaken. For a legend who lived loudly, his final truth was heartbreakingly tender. Regretting the paths not taken. In the autumn of his life, Jack Nicholson reflected on choices with the same intensity he once brought to a film set. Born on April 22, 1937, Nicholson became one of Hollywood's most enduring icons, winning 3 Academy Awards across a career that spanned more than 50 years. Yet, in interviews from the 2000s and 2010s, he returned often to the subject of regret, not regret for his wildest actions, but for the quiet omissions. You rarely regret anything that you did, but you might regret things that you didn't do, he once confessed. It was a telling admission. Nicholson's life was defined by audacity: his breakout in 1969's Easy Rider, his Oscar in 1976 for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, his legendary turn as Jack Torrance in 1980's The Shining. Yet, when he looked back, the wounds were not from risks taken, but from opportunities never pursued. Roles he turned down, romances he allowed to fade, friendships left unattended. These became the ghosts that haunted him. For Nicholson, the ache was not in failure, but in the silence of possibility. The irony was striking. Here was a man who lived louder than most, nominated 12 times for Oscars, a record for male actors. Yet he admitted that his greatest pain came from hesitation. He had seized stages, conquered red carpets, and etched himself into cinema history by the 1990s. But privately, he replayed the what-ifs. What if he had been braver in love? What if he had tried painting more seriously in the 1970s? What if he had chosen family over films at times? This quiet reckoning reframed Nicholson not just as a rebel or a legend, but as a man facing the cost of omission. To fans, he seemed fearless, but his words told a different story: that even titans of cinema long for the roads not taken. In these reflections, regret became tender, not tragic. A reminder that no amount of fame, not even 6 decades of acclaim, can silence the longing for what might have been. But not all of Nicholson's regrets were abstract musings on missed roles or faded romances. Some were rooted in truths that cut to the heart of identity itself. In the 1970s, Nicholson learned that the woman he believed to be his mother was, in fact, his grandmother, and the woman he thought was his sister was truly his mother. That revelation, uncovered when Nicholson was in his 30s, changed everything. To understand him, we must step into the shadow of that hidden truth. Living amid secrecy and loss. The story broke publicly in 1974, but Nicholson himself had only recently learned the secret. For more than 30 years, he had lived believing that his grandmother, Ethel May, was his mother, and that June, the woman he called sister, was just that. In reality, June was his biological mother, and Ethel May had raised him as her own. It was a deception born of 1930s convention, when unwed pregnancies carried stigma, and families often chose secrecy over truth. The revelation arrived when Nicholson was already a star, fresh from the acclaim of Easy Rider in 1969 and 5 Easy Pieces in 1970. Time magazine, in a profile published in 1974, confirmed the secret to the public. For Nicholson, the discovery must have been shattering. The woman he had called Mom for more than 3 decades was not who he thought she was. The woman he thought was his sister had died in 1963, taking her secret to the grave. Nicholson never spoke bitterly about it, but the regret was evident between his words. To live under a mistaken identity for 36 years is to live with a fractured foundation. His family's silence had shaped his relationships, his sense of self, his very story. Regret here was not about actions undone, but about years spent in ignorance, about hugs given without knowing their true meaning, about love misnamed, about the time he never had with the truth. For Nicholson, this regret was delicate, almost too heavy to voice. He once said, "It was a pretty dramatic event, but it wasn't what I'd call traumatizing. I didn't have to deal with it." Yet that calm belied the weight of the revelation. A lifetime recalibrated, a family history reframed, a personal myth unraveled. For a man who built his career on fearless characters, Nicholson's real-life script revealed a quiet sadness, that sometimes the people closest to us remain strangers. If family secrecy left Nicholson wrestling with identity, his later years brought a different kind of regret: withdrawal. By the 2010s, after officially retiring in 2010, Nicholson receded from public life. He chose solitude, spending his days in a modest home overlooking Mulholland Drive, rather than on red carpets or sets. For some, this was peace. For Nicholson, it became another regret. The sense that perhaps he had pulled away from the world too soon, leaving connection behind. Retreating instead of re-engaging. In interviews from the 2010s, Nicholson admitted he was happier in my dinky little house than amid Hollywood's relentless glare. At 83 years old in 2020, he had not appeared in a film for a full decade, his last being How Do You Know in 2010. While retirement gave him freedom, it also brought isolation. For a man once at the center of Hollywood's energy, the Oscars, Lakers games, red carpets, the silence of retreat carried its own sorrow. Fans noticed his absence keenly. By 2013, rumors of ill health circulated when Nicholson declined new roles, including a part in Nebraska. Friends explained it was not illness, but a fading memory that deterred him. Still, by withdrawing from the community he once illuminated, Nicholson created a distance hard to bridge. The man who electrified audiences in Chinatown in 1974 and Batman in 1989 was now a figure glimpsed only in paparazzi photos, seated courtside at Lakers games. The regret here was not about leaving acting behind. It was about losing the rhythm of connection. Nicholson's circle grew smaller. Former co-stars and friends aged, some passed, and the communal spark of Hollywood dimmed. By choosing retreat, he lost not only the frenzy, but the warmth of shared work and camaraderie. For a man who once thrived on energy, silence could feel like a theft. And so, in solitude, Nicholson may have discovered a regret subtler than missed roles: the regret of absence. He had lived loud, then faded quietly. He confessed to enjoying the peace, yet admitted to longing for conversation, for laughter, for presence. For Nicholson, retreat was a choice, but one that carried the ache of what it cost. But not all regrets were about solitude or family. Some were tied to the very relationships that defined Nicholson's public persona. Known for his charm, wit, and endless romances, he once quipped, "The girls only did that because they missed me more than they thought they would." Beneath the humor lay something more fragile: the regret of being loved for his legend, not his true self. To continue, we must step into Nicholson's regrets about love and image. The regret of becoming legend, not girlfriend. Jack Nicholson built his reputation as Hollywood's great charmer. Through the 1970s, 1980s, and 90s, his name was linked to stars like Angelica Houston, Lara Flynn Boyle, and Rebecca Broussard. Paparazzi loved his swagger, the grin framed by sunglasses, the image of a man untamed. But Nicholson himself sometimes acknowledged a quiet sorrow. The girls only did that because they missed me more than they thought they would. He joked in an interview from the 2000s. It was humor, but it carried truth. The regret here was not about passion lost. It was about authenticity blurred. Nicholson knew that many women were drawn not just to Jack, but to Jack Nicholson. Oscar winner in 1976, Hollywood rebel of 1969, Joker of 1989. The larger-than-life figure often stood between the man and genuine intimacy. He wondered, as he aged into his 70s, how many romances were shaped less by love than by legend. Fame, as intoxicating as it was, distorted closeness. Relationships, some lasting years, often ended in bitterness or distance. His decades-long on-again, off-again bond with Angelica Houston, which began in 1973, ended in heartbreak by 1990, after Nicholson fathered a child with another partner. His regrets lingered not in scandal, but in wondering if he could have been better at nurturing rather than dazzling. He loved women, adored their company, but confessed to friends that he often struggled with commitment. To be desired as an image is flattering, but it leaves emptiness when the lights fade. By his later years, Nicholson admitted loneliness. "I would love that one last romance," he said in his 70s, a wish tinged with regret. The man who had been celebrated as Hollywood's perennial bachelor found himself longing for something quieter, more real. The tragedy, if one can call it that, was not the absence of love. It was the presence of too much love shaped by fame. For Nicholson, regret was being remembered as legend, not as partner. But romance was not the only place Nicholson skirted around depth. He admitted late in life that he often avoided introspection. Death, aging, and regret were subjects he thought about, but rarely voiced. "These are subjects that we think about all the time, but don't necessarily talk about," he confessed. For Nicholson, the greatest irony was not that he lacked regret, but that he refused to explore it deeply until too late. His avoidance became its own regret. Avoiding introspection until it was late. Jack Nicholson was famous for his intensity on screen, but known privately for sidestepping heavy reflection. In interviews throughout the 1980s, 1990s, and even into the 2000s, he laughed off questions about mortality or meaning. Yet, he later admitted, "I've thought about death a lot. These are things we think about, but don't talk about." At 70 years old in 2007, he began speaking more openly, hinting that avoidance had cost him years of emotional growth. He often said, "I don't have real regrets," but the phrasing revealed something subtler. It wasn't that he lacked regrets. It was that he refused to go there. Nicholson lived through the cultural revolutions of 1969, the hedonism of the 1970s, the box office dominance of the 1980s. Surrounded by noise, he chose action over reflection. The regret, spoken indirectly, was that he had avoided the inner work that might have given more peace when the applause faded. By the 2010s, long after retiring in 2010, Nicholson acknowledged that silence on inner truths left him unprepared for the quiet of old age. Without the distractions of film sets, premieres, or awards ceremonies, the thoughts he had long avoided became harder to escape. He had played men confronting madness, corruption, and mortality. Jack Torrance in 1980's The Shining, Frank Costello in 2006's The Departed. But he admitted he had rarely confronted such darkness in himself until much later. Regret here was not about scandal, but about delay. To only begin asking why at 70 or 80 is to confront decades of missed opportunity for understanding. Nicholson's brilliance lay in performance, but his late-life reflections suggested he wished he had embraced honesty sooner. By avoiding introspection, he robbed himself of wisdom that could have enriched not only his art, but his life. It was not too little, but it was too late. And yet, even as Nicholson confessed these delayed reflections, another unspoken regret hovered around him: the price of his own success. With a career spanning more than 5 decades and 12 Academy Award nominations, more than any male actor in history, he became Hollywood royalty. But that crown came with costs: lost privacy, fractured relationships, and the sense that stardom itself can overshadow tenderness. To grasp Nicholson's deepest regrets, we must confront the price of becoming an icon. The unspoken price of stardom. Jack Nicholson's career stretched from the late 1950s, when he took bit parts in low-budget films, to his retirement in 2010 after more than 50 years in Hollywood. Along the way, he earned 3 Oscars for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1976, Terms of Endearment in 1983, and As Good as It Gets in 1998. He was nominated 12 times, a record for men. His success was unparalleled, but even legends pay a price. The price began with privacy. By the 1970s, Nicholson's home on Mulholland Drive became infamous for celebrity gatherings, but also a prison of sorts. Paparazzi stalked his movements. Relationships, like his romance with Angelica Houston from 1973 to 1990, became tabloid fodder. The man who relished freedom found himself trapped by exposure. Fame granted him riches, but stole his anonymity. The regret? That intimacy was often compromised by spotlight. The cost extended to family. Nicholson fathered 6 children with 5 women between 1963 and 1992, but his devotion to acting often eclipsed his role as father. In later years, he admitted he wasn't always present. Stardom demanded endless hours on set. The Shining in 1980 filmed for over 13 months, draining him emotionally and physically. While the world gained a masterpiece, his children lost time with their father. Regret here was silent, but undeniable. By 2010, Nicholson's retirement marked the end of an era. Fans saw a man who had lived wildly, richly, triumphantly. But behind the curtain was a quieter truth. To become an icon meant sacrificing tenderness. The regret was not that he had achieved greatness. It was that greatness demanded a toll in moments unseen. For Nicholson, the unspoken price of stardom was a life lived large, but sometimes without the gentleness he craved. And as Nicholson stepped further into solitude after retirement, another regret surfaced, not in his words, but in how his career ended. Rumors about his health grew, yet he faded without a final statement, without a dramatic goodbye. For a man whose life was marked by bold entrances and unforgettable performances, his quiet exit felt uncharacteristic. The question lingered: did Jack Nicholson regret leaving the stage so softly, instead of orchestrating a farewell that matched the roar of his legend? Regret of the quiet fade, not the loud goodbye. For more than 5 decades, Jack Nicholson lived loudly. From his breakout in Easy Rider in 1969 to his sinister brilliance as the Joker in Batman in 1989, to his Oscar-winning turn in As Good as It Gets. In 1998, his career was built on impact, yet his retirement came quietly. After How Do You Know? In 2010, Nicholson simply stepped away. No farewell tour, no final film, no grand curtain call. For a man who thrived on spectacle, this retreat carried its own sadness. Rumors swirled. By 2013, outlets speculated about memory loss, while others wondered if health issues forced him to stop. Nicholson denied the whispers, assuring fans he was fine. Still, the absence was undeniable. A career that spanned 50 years, with 12 Oscar nominations, ended not with applause, but with silence. Fans mourned not only the loss of his presence, but the lack of closure. For Nicholson himself, the regret may have been in leaving without a proper goodbye. His legacy was strong enough to endure, of course. Chinatown in 1974, The Shining in 1980, The Departed in 2006. These films would live forever. Yet Nicholson, a man of dramatic entrances and unforgettable lines, seemed oddly subdued in his exit. He once hinted that he wished he had made a final statement, a film that felt like a punctuation mark rather than an ellipsis. Regret lingered in the gap between the roar of his life and the hush of his departure. The quiet fade reflected another truth. Time eventually silences even the loudest voices. Nicholson did not leave the stage on his own terms. Instead, life ushered him off. The regret, unspoken but present, was that the man who lived boldly did not get to leave boldly. For fans, and for Nicholson alike, the exit felt smaller than the life that preceded it. But Nicholson's regrets were not only about career exits. They were also about aging itself. At 70 years old, he admitted feeling unexpectedly young, freed in ways he hadn't expected. Yet, he confessed, this joy came late, too late to savor earlier decades with the same grace. The regret was simple but profound. He had not embraced aging until it became unavoidable. To understand Nicholson's late-life reflections, we must see how he reframed age not as decline, but as gift. Not embracing aging until it became intimate. Jack Nicholson turned 70 in 2007, a milestone he marked with surprising candor. He told interviewers he felt younger, even liberated. The slowing pace gave him room for reflection, for appreciation of life's subtler joys. Yet he admitted that this acceptance came too late. In his 40s and 50s, he raged against age, chasing youth, indulging excess, filling his life with noise. Only when his body inevitably slowed did he see aging not as loss, but as a strange kind of grace. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, Nicholson embodied vitality. He partied at Lakers games, filmed long hours on sets like The Shining in 1980 or A Few Good Men in 1992, and surrounded himself with younger company. To age, in those decades, was to risk invisibility in Hollywood's harsh lens. Nicholson fought that invisibility with swagger. But by the 2000s, he realized the battle was futile. Age had arrived, and with it came unexpected humility. The regret he confessed was not that he grew old, but that he had not welcomed maturity sooner. The later years revealed the joys of slowing down, time with his children, appreciation of art, and quiet afternoons at his Mulholland home. These pleasures, he admitted in his 70s, might have been savored earlier had he not resisted. Aging, he realized, was not the enemy. It was a privilege denied to many peers who had died young. By the time Nicholson reached his 80s, he seemed to hold this truth closer. He stopped fearing invisibility. He accepted solitude, cherished reflection, and even found humor in the process of decline. Yet, regret lingered. Why had it taken so long to see aging as a gift? For a man who lived through every kind of excess, the sweetest discovery came late. Nicholson's regret was not aging itself, but the decades spent fighting it instead of embracing it. Yet even as Nicholson reflected on aging, he acknowledged another regret: professional, not personal. Despite his immense success, he admitted that he didn't truly find his own voice until Easy Rider premiered at Cannes in 1969. Until then, he often felt like a supporting player, uncertain of his place in cinema. The regret, he confessed, was that authenticity came late. What might his life have looked like if he had claimed his voice earlier? Regret at never finding his voice early enough. Jack Nicholson's career began humbly. In the late 1950s, he appeared in low-budget films, often playing small, forgettable roles. Through the 1960s, he worked steadily but without recognition, sometimes questioning if acting was his true calling. Then came Easy Rider in 1969, screened at Cannes. Nicholson's performance as George Hanson electrified audiences and critics alike. He later admitted that was the moment he finally felt he had found his voice. He was 32 years old. The regret was clear. It had taken more than a decade to feel authentic. Nicholson wondered how much earlier he could have embraced his identity if he had trusted himself. The 1960s had been a preamble, filled with auditions, rejections, and doubt. While contemporaries like Dustin Hoffman and Al Pacino surged to recognition, Nicholson slogged through forgettable credits. By the time fame arrived, he had lost years of creative self-belief. Even in the 1970s, as he won Oscars for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest in 1976 and built his reputation with Chinatown in 1974, Nicholson remembered those years of silence. The shadow of deferred authenticity lingered. It was not that he lacked talent, it was that he had not embraced it fully. He often mused that his voice was waiting for validation rather than claiming it outright. That dependency, he suggested, was its own regret. By his later years, Nicholson reframed this truth more gently. Finding his voice late was still finding it. Yet, he confessed to wondering how many films, roles, and even relationships might have been different if confidence had come sooner. For a man who eventually became cinema's rebel, the irony was that rebellion had waited for permission. His regret was not failure. It was delay. And yet, as Nicholson sifted through omissions, solitude, secrecy, and delay, he reached a final conclusion. Regret alone is not enough. He often repeated that regrets don't define us, growth does. His last reflections were not about bitterness, but about courage, even belated. In confronting his regrets, Nicholson crafted his final arc, not tragedy, but tenderness. To close his story, we must see how he turned regret itself into meaning. Ultimately, regret isn't enough. In the end, Nicholson circled back to the idea that regrets are inevitable. At 87 years old in 2024, he told friends that regrets come less from what you do and more from what you don't. Yet he resisted letting them define him. Regrets don't make you, he said. They invite you. For Nicholson, the invitation was to see his life not as a ledger of mistakes, but as a story of growth shaped by choices missed and made. His 5 deepest regrets, paths not taken, family secrecy, solitude, romantic illusions, and delayed introspection were not wounds but lessons. They revealed longing, yes, but also resilience. Across 5 decades, Nicholson carried fame's crown, but he never stopped asking what it cost. Even as he regretted omissions, he celebrated the fullness of his career. 3 Oscars, 12 nominations, countless unforgettable roles. His story was contradiction. A man who had everything, yet still wondered about what if. The tender irony is that Nicholson's regrets made him more human. Fans saw the rebel in Easy Rider in 1969, the madness of The Shining in 1980, the weary mobster in The Departed in 2006. But behind each role was a man quietly searching for meaning. Regret, for Nicholson, was not weakness. It was the mirror that finally reflected the man behind the legend. His arc was dramatic not because it was flawless, but because it was flawed. And so, Nicholson's story ends not as tragedy, but as confession. He admitted regrets, but he carried them with courage. He understood too late, perhaps, but he still understood. The boy from New Jersey, born in 1937, became the most nominated actor in history, and yet he still longed for intimacy, honesty, and authenticity. His final lesson is simple. Regret is inevitable, but it is not the end. Growth, even belated, is enough.